welcome to POWTS Chat for October 2025. I hope everyone has had a good season so far and is taking advantage of this beautiful fall weather. I just want to thank you all for choosing to spend your time with us today. I know that it's a very busy time of year, both for family and vacation reasons, but also work. We're trying to get things done before winter comes. So thank you all for joining us. So today's POWTS Chat will be like so many we've been doing in the past months. It'll be split into two sections. In the first section, Matt will continue his series on Wisconsin landforms, and after that, you'll be hearing a little bit from me on the subject of learning from our failures and a few general updates. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Matt.
Okay, so we're going to continue on discussing Wisconsin landforms. We've been doing this one across the state here. You can see our map, what we've seen so far. First month that we talked about was the driftless area in the southwest part of the state. Then we did sort of kettle moraine drumlin fields in the southeast. Then we discussed what we sort of called the northern highlands or sort of northern forest soils, and concentrated on sort of lake region, Vilas, Oneida, and then some of the other soils found across the north. And today's, we're going to talk about the Niagara Escarpment. So this is a little finger of, well, a feature that sort of comes down the finger of the hand of Wisconsin through Door County, Kewaunee, Manitowoc, sort of down that edge there. So first of all, what is an escarpment? So it's basically it's some tilted or it can be some fairly level layers of rock, and they weather differently. So how the escarpment forms is that we have a hard erosion resistant rock on the surface, and then we have softer lower layers erode underneath there. This is also how escarpments are basically what causes waterfalls. If it's not tipped away and it's actually tipped towards the rock ledge, that's how we get a waterfall. Is that the water would flow over that edge there, and it's that slow erosion there and being undercut there is causing that steep rock face there. They've also a term as a questa. It's not commonly used, but it's technical terms. If you want to throw a fancy $5 word out for the day, that's sort of another name for this. But so the escarpments are basically, again, we have a stronger, sort of a more weather resistant rock on top, and we have something that's weathering underneath that causes sort of that abrupt rock face is what we're getting. So the Niagara Escarpment is a feature that's a very prominent rock ridge that runs about 1,000 miles in this arc that goes from southeast Wisconsin up along the shore of Lake Winnebago, the east shore of Lake Winnebago, and continues on up through Brown County into Door County along the western edge of Door, continues up into Michigan. And you can sort of see here, if you notice that black line as it curves around, how it traces sort of an outline of the bottom side of the UP and then up into Lake Huron there. You can see how it's got that split in Lake Huron, why it's got that rock ridge sort of in between. That's part of the Niagara Escarpment. And then it drops down into Ontario, and that's why Ontario sort of has those sort of two wings kind of thing, the one that juts north and then the one that juts east into New York. So you can see that black line is the Niagara Escarpment. It's part of that rock ridge that runs in a long arc, circular around sort of the state of Michigan or the lower peninsula of Michigan. So it crosses Wisconsin, UP, Ontario into New York, and then where it gets its place name is where it crosses at Niagara Falls. So Niagara Falls there, it's the joint between Ontario and New York, right there at the black line, and where the state and the province meet, that's where Niagara Falls is. And so if you look at it, here's a close up of Niagara Falls. What do you see? You see, a rock ledge, that cuesta as they call it, that you've got that harder rock resistant on top. You get something underneath that's being undermined. This is basically, here's your waterfall. So that is the escarpment. So the Niagara Escarpment runs in that large arc there and comes into Wisconsin and gives us some of our features here. So, as we saw, we had that line. You could see how it went around the arc of Michigan there. It's part of what they call the Michigan Basin. This shows this is colors of the soils based on age. But if you look at it in more detail, even some of the formations within an age, it's like a bullseye right around Michigan, and it's sort of this basin. The Michigan's sort of a lower dished area, and it's higher up around the edge. So you can think of it as sort of like a bowl, or if you took like whatever layers and depressed the middle and curled the edges up. That's sort of what we're seeing there in Michigan. Well, that again, that Niagara escarpment is part of the rocks as they sort of spiral around the lower peninsula of Michigan. So it's all part of that Michigan basin, that sort of that lighter purple rock, part of the Niagara escarpment, and the rocks that form the escarpment. They continue around, and they actually continue down farther south in Wisconsin and into Illinois, but it's no longer visible above the ground. So the escarpment starts to recede, it gets lower and lower and lower, and it's no longer above ground. So you get the same limestone dolostone can also be seen in Illinois if you've traveled. There's the massive Thornton Quarry on I-80 294 down there. If you've ever seen it, that's actually the interstate through the middle. It's sort of like this little causeway through the middle. It's actually pretty impressive. You know it when you drive past it. You look on both sides, and you got this huge open quarry, open pits. But yeah, it's pretty impressive. But that is actually the same material that makes up the Niagara Escarpment. It's just there. It's no longer above grade. It's actually in the ground, but that's where they're mining that same stuff that continues up into Door County. It's the same rock formations. So the extent of the escarpment here, goes down again the west side of Door County, a little bit in Kewaunee, Brown, Calumet, Fond du Lac, but then it starts to sort of fade out as it goes farther. So it's discontinuous in some spots. It's very prominent. Along some of the western edge of Door County. I know in Brown County, there's a pretty big ridge there, and then you get up on top of the ridge and you see some of the windmills and some of the broadcast towers for the Green Bay stations are up on top of the ridge. High Cliff, Park down in Calumet. So you'll see some of those where it really does stick out. It is prominent, but it's Silurian dolomite, and it overlies dolomite and limestones of Ordovician age. And so those are the softer ones that are undercut, and then you've got that harder cap sitting on top. But that underlying formation of those bedrocks and that do influence the counties farther east of that edge. So this is just what we see of the edge, but those again, when we saw back in the pictures of the Michigan basement, those rocks do extend farther out into a little bit into Lake Michigan, and they do have influence on the soils and what we would see there. So all those eastern soils are sort of influenced there. So by being dolomite and limestone there, that escarpment again is the edge of what we call a karst landscape. And so karst landscape is areas that have, are underlain by soluble bedrock, the limestone mostly, and some dolomites, it's a little harder to weather. They're a little more resistant, but it's chemical weathering. And you think of chemical weathering, well, water's a chemical, and water, can erode the limestone, especially if you get a little bit of acid rain or something like that get mixed in. That limestone is soluble by water over time, millions of years. So karst landscape is, you can see here in the picture, is that we will get areas where we get, seepages or things or water going down through, and you find cracks in the limestone bedrock, and then we can have some weathering or bigger cracks that'll open up. And I'll probably show it next time we talk about glacial lake basin soils, that you see some more of this karst landscape, and you see, like, you can actually see the cracks of the bedrock in aerial photos. You can see where the color variations of where soils are wet and dry, and it sort of shows up where those cracks are. But this is basically what's going on with the karst. What they call a karst landscape is that we get dissolution of that bedrock, and water can move through there, but also will form things as caves and underwater, caverns and stuff, maybe filled with water, or underground caverns that are filled with water. But there's dozens of caves known to exist along the Niagara Escarpment in Wisconsin here. Some of those that are a little more famous, like Ledgeview Nature Center and the Maribel Caves. Those are pretty well known, cave systems in the karst landscape. So we have other areas that are karst, like the driftless area, but we do have it along this corridor here in conjunction with the Niagara Escarpment. So a couple of the soils that we're looking at in the area, tried to pick a couple that are, again, somewhat representative or tied to some of that karst landscape slash, limestone bedrock kind of things. So Somerville Soil Series, again, is sort of what I call representative series in the area. This one's, really sort of ties in with Door County. I mean, there is some extension up into farther up into the UP, and it wraps around, and I'm assuming that there's probably stuff very similar along that arc that goes over into Canada also. But this one is listed as a lithic Eutrudeps. So the things to pick out on that is that, remember from when we're talking about the soil classifications of the groups of soils, that an ept is an inceptisol, which means it's not very well developed or hasn't had a lot of time to develop. So you're not going to see a whole lot of development in those. And then lithic, if you remember, where sort of the Latin root from that lithic, it's a lithic contact, means that we basically got bedrock close. So the description of it out of the soil survey is a shallow, well-drained soil, and it's formed in loamy materials. It's sort of a sandy loam material, overlying limestone on moraines. So this is material that's been dropped down till that's been dropped on top of basically a bedrock. So this is what it looks like. Well, if you could think, if we got lithic contact, we've got bedrock contact. We don't have a lot of it. So again, this is in centimeters here. So 20 centimeters, we're not talking a whole lot. We're talking, well, less than 20 inches. We're talking shallow. And it does vary because, as you can imagine, where the bedrock contact is, you might have somewhere you got 2 feet. You might have somewhere closer to, 10 inches. So it's going to vary. You also have a wide range of slopes on the Somerville Soil Series. It could be 0 up to 35. Like most of them, they seem to, middle, a lot of 2 to 6s, a lot of 6 to 12s in there. But very shallow lithic contact. So we're encountering, bedrock. So this isn't, I know it's a smaller picture, but, we're not encountering, just a piece of rock. And in some cases, we will see that where we have, cobbles or something are coming up into the soil. Or a lot of times here, that's something else to pay attention to, is that instead of being round, they're actually flat. And now you're talking flagstones or channers. So a little sort of odd one, but those are basically flat rocks to describe, and limestone will break into those flat rocks. So that's where we get the term flagstone instead of a stone. But anyway, shallow lithic contact, we're encountering the bedrock there. May have a weak E horizon, so they did note that sometimes you'll have a little bit of an E horizon, or that washed out gray zone between the A horizon and the Bs down below. So we may have some weak E's, but the typical description doesn't show that. So this is a typical Somerville profile, so to speak. And again, they vary some depending on what you see. But remember, on the picture there, those numbers there, the 0, 5, 23, 41, those are in centimeters. But we're seeing things such as 0 to 2, we get a 10YR 3-2, moderate granular, loam. And then we have 2 to 9, we have a BW. And if you remember from some of our classification stuff that we talked about before, BW just shows some kind of development in the B horizon, but it's not enough to show accumulation of clay to make a T horizon, or it's not like the spodosols where we'd see a BH or a BS. So we're seeing some development, and basically the development is we had a color change. Most likely is what we're seeing, and some structure change. So something's going on there, but Not much. And that also ties in with the inceptisol that we talked about for classification, is that it hasn't had a lot of age for nature to work on the soil, so we don't have a lot of development. We're not forming a lot of things. That's why it sometimes has an E, but not often. Once we start getting the E, then we're starting to see, a little more development, and then we're running into probably other classifications, and it's probably not an inceptisol anymore. But it can have weak E, they've noted in inclusions. But anyway, the BW1 7.5 IR44, moderate, medium, subangular blocky loam yet, and then farther down, then it changed a little bit and fades more to a fine sandy loam. So you get that sort of the loamy tills, fine sandy loam tills is what we're seeing on there. And then in here on the typical, again, typical, and they vary, typical profile, then we're talking 16 to 26, we're encountering limestone. And that's a typical soil series. So not a whole lot to really work with. So as you can see, sort of what are our problems? Well, we got bedrock limitation close to the surface. It can be some steep slopes. There are some Somerville reported on some steeper sites here. This is a site that's a Somerville. You can see the mound out there. It actually sort of blends into the grass pretty easy, but maybe an 18-inch lift or so mound. But then again, we still have a potential for groundwater contamination. The sites are with that karst topography. We have to be careful with making sure that we site it well, that we're identifying our limitations well, and we properly site it, because if we get it wrong here, discharging effluent into that crevice bedrock is, it's a high potential for contaminating groundwater. So, in line with what I've been doing before, I sort of show you a couple different soils, because can't always have just one representative. So, the Namer soil I'm going to bring out here is another representative series of Niagara escarpment area, and you look, it sort of tracks along very similar to what we saw with with the Somerville here. But this one is representative of a different order. Instead of an endosol, this one is actually a mollisol, a hapludol. It was really interesting that they call this a mollisol, but that OLL shows it's a mollisol, but also we have lithic in the front of it. So it's a lithic contact. We have a bedrock issue with it. So this is a lithic mollisol. This one shows as an excessively drained soil. Sort of interesting how they catalog some of this or classify some of these, but they say it's excessively drained, and we'll talk a little bit about that, why it's excessively drained, because there's not much to drain, and a thin mantle of loess. So this is a little bit different. Instead of the till, this is a loess over top of a very shallow lithic contact, again on glaciated karst uplands. So a little bit different, but similar in the same areas. Um, this is what this one looks like. You can looking at a whole lot here. So moderate to little slope, 0 to 12 are what most of these seem to fall on. I do see a few that are taller or higher, but I also see that this is also comes close with some rock outcrops. As you can see, we don't have hardly any soil, so having the rock stick out there isn't necessarily uncommon, because it's extremely thin loess cap over top of the bedrock, and you can see how the bedrock's working its way up into that loess cap, all the free floating stones that are coming up into it. So what's a typical profile? This one's an easy one. 0 to 6, 10 wire 2-2, very black. And based on that, they're calling it a mollisol. Typically, you think of a mollisol as a deep, dark, prairie soils, but they classified this as a mollisol in here, based on the dark, deep organic, the dark organic matter in the topsoil profile. But it's sort of interesting that it's weak subangular blocky. It's a silt loam from the loess, but it's right on top of dolestone, a little bit harder cap material that karst topography stuff. But it's interesting. Real easy profile. 6 inches. So for us, what are we talking about? Well, we have an extreme bedrock location limitation. This is a site I found that was on that. These are holding tanks and property. Very high potential for groundwater contamination. The other issues you're going to run into is not only, maybe if you have 6 inches or 7 or 8, maybe you can put a mound out there with, that amount of soil. But the other issue that you have is that, like this, how are you going to get the tanks in the ground? I don't know if you can see it there, but you see there's sort of like a nice colored, lighter colored ring right around those tanks there. You can see obviously, when they dug those tanks in, they probably had to blast in there to get those tanks set in that rock, and you probably got a little pocket of different drainage there compared to the rest of the landscape. But that's something else to be aware of, even on the previous site. If you only have, 16, 18, 20 inches to bedrock, still putting tanks out there is an issue. And I know those that work up in the area, it's not just getting the system in tanks in the ground, whether it's a septic tank or a holding tank. So anyway, these have extreme bedrock limitations. So sort of comparison between the two, Somerville, a little bit different. Parent material is loamy till. Namer soil is loess. Site position, Somerville is a little bit more variable. Namer is more moderate to no slope or closer to levels. Limitation both on them is bedrock. Somerville, you got more of a potential for a mound, where Namer soil, you're probably looking more towards a holding tank. Now you can get some each way on those, but in Namer you may be able to get some mounds in. But a lot of times you're looking at holding tanks. And even that, like I said, fun trying to get them into the ground because of the bedrock issue. But anyway, that's sort of a couple of soils there and a little bit of introduction to what the Niagara Escarpment is and what that looks like, and how it sort of relates to everything around the world. So
All right. So here's back to our original agenda. So we went through our Wisconsin landform section. The next about half hour of the presentation here is going to be divided up into two sections. One, learning from failures, and two, just our general updates where we go through some hot button topics. So like I said, we're going to move on to the topic of learning from our failures. If you've been sitting there, since you heard the agenda at the beginning of the session, thinking that I was going to admit to a personal failure on a Zoom in front of 100 people, you're going to be disappointed, because the failures that we're going to be talking about today are systems that have failed that DSPS staff have been out to this summer. And we're going to talk about what may have gone wrong and what could possibly be done better next time and what we can learn from that to avoid these situations. So here's a photo of a mound that's leaking out of the toe. The photo was taken about 2 months after the installation of the mound, and its failure was discovered when the property owner went to mow and discovered that it was, far too wet for him to do that. So the DSPS staff member was called out and they did an investigation of the failure. So I want to give you a few seconds here to look at the photo and think to yourself, what is the cause of this failure? If you, immediately know you're a wizard of some kind, ponder on what could possibly be done to fix it moving forward. Okay, now that you've had a second to look at it, I'm going to open up a poll. Hopefully it works, because we haven't done this in a while, and just to see what you think might have caused it. So the question here is, what do you think caused this mound to fail? Do you think it was overuse in the house? Things like leaky fixtures, more people, home businesses, improper installation techniques, things like plowing, materials, dose settings, things like that. Improper siting, so things like runoff, drainage, the slope shape, site conditions. Do you think it was an improper design for the soils? Or do you think it was an inaccurate soil test? So I'm just going to give folks a few seconds here to answer, maybe 15, 20 seconds. When I see, quite a few people have answered, I'll end the poll and share the results. All right, so here are the results. So we actually have a pretty wide split. So 12% or so of people think it was from overuse in the house, leaky fixtures, things like that. 40% of people think that we have an improper installation technique. Something is going wrong in the installation. Some people think that it could be improper siting. Some think improper design for the soil test, and some think an inaccurate soil test. So kind of interesting. We have a pretty wide split here. And so maybe you're thinking, Katie, that's really not fair. Judging this situation, this not so good situation, just from a photo. So here's some additional context. Before installation, the soils and site were verified by the county and the soil tester. Obviously, they were out there. The aerial images show previous heavy use, like vehicle storage, something like that. The house is new. There's no leaking plumbing that we know of. And let's just say, for the sake of the exercise here, that it's a normal size family, no bigger than what the house is designed for, and there's no home businesses in this in this scenario. So does that change your thoughts at all about why the mound failed? I'm not going to open the quiz again, but I just want you to think about it. Would your answer change? So when the DSPS staff member tried digging into the soil, in the unsaturated area of it, they found that the soils were heavily compacted. Basically, you couldn't get a shovel into the dry soil. So if you picked, uh, you know, compaction really wasn't on that quiz, but if that's what came to your mind, I guess imaginary gold star for you. Hopefully you haven't had to learn that the hard way. Hopefully this hasn't happened to you before. The thing is we don't know if the compaction happened before the soil test. Hopefully it wasn't, because the county and the soil tester were out there to verify the soils. Between the soil test and installation, maybe that happened. Hopefully it didn't. During the installation, if they were driving on the downslope toe or something like that, or possibly after, that can happen too. But what matters, I guess, in the end, if our main goal isn't to point fingers, is that the soils were compacted enough that the wastewater couldn't infiltrate into the mound properly. And somewhere along the line in the process that happened. So now that we've seen that failure, what can we learn from that, and what could have been done differently to prevent it? Let's, for now, I guess, in this exercise, assume that the soils were compacted prior to installation. If that's the case, well, we need to do a better job of identifying compaction and designing for it if it can't absolutely be avoided, right? The best solution to compaction is avoiding the area, but if you can't do it, then we'll talk about it a little bit. It's also important to note that compaction comes in varying degrees. So the photo that you see on your screen here might look like rock fragments from a distance. From your screen, it might look like rock fragments, but in reality, it's just very, very compacted soil. So this is not the kind of compaction that is easy to fix, and it's really not the kind that we're talking about today. Something like this needs to be avoided or removed, or, broken up in a way and some compaction this heavy is going to take a lot of time and a lot of work. So here's a more realistic example of the compaction that we can actually address in, maybe a shorter period of time. So on the left side of the picture here is a sample from a compacted field. You can see that there's a distinct platiness and the roots are traveling left to right instead of, up and down. And on the right, you can see a sample from the fence row of that same field that has a really nice granular structure to it. It doesn't have that same compaction. So the solution to this, if you're siting a system and you can't just put it in the fence row, is not just to ignore the compaction that's in that field sample and not report it on the soil test, but there are a few things that we can do. One option, and this works pretty well for, pretty compacted sites, and not to the degree that we saw in that first picture, but for a lot of sites, is to rejuvenate the soil. So what is done here is the soil is plowed to break up the compaction and then planted to a crop. What that crop is going to depend on the severity of the compaction and how long the soil will have to be left, how long it'll have to be left idle. So if it's mild compaction, maybe we can get away with an annual crop like, wheat or rye. One growing season basically. But typically that it isn't so. So typically we're going to be planting a perennial crop like alfalfa or something like that, which can really help with redeveloping the structure of the soil. For this to work really well, we need to plow it, obviously, to break up the platiness, and then have at least one growing season pass, including a freeze and thaw cycle. So that freeze and thaw, along with the action of the roots and the other, organics in the soil, both, organic acids and the organics like worms and things like that, should help reaggregate the soil to a more suitable structure. So at that point, then the soil can be re-examined, and hopefully the compaction will be gone to a degree that maybe it can be used. So here's a photo of a site where this was done. So it was plowed, it was planted to alfalfa, it was allowed to rest, and the crop allowed to grow, and then it was re-examined. So you can see that there's still a little bit of platiness in that picture. If you take the bottom of the Munsell and go directly to the left, you can still see there's a little bit of platiness there, but the structure was well developed enough, the compaction broken up enough that a 4.5 linear load right mound could be placed on top of it. So better than nothing. So what else could we possibly do? If the soils were compacted prior to installation, if we're looking at it from that angle. Well, if the surface compaction is really spotty or not well developed, or even if the soils feel like they would be susceptible to compaction during construction, then it might be wise to integrate sand into the plowed area instead of just plopping it on top of an already plowed soil. So what you do is you take a light tracked vehicle, like your skid steer or something like that. You don't want the giant backhoe out there. And you place 6 inches of sand in an area that will be plowed. You want to do a small test patch to make sure that you're not, throwing time and money away by doing this, to make sure that you're going to achieve your anticipated result. So, do a small test patch. You can see it in that picture. They did that. So if that test patch area kind of looks good, then the sand can be placed all over and then the area plowed like you normally would. So this way, when you do it this way, the sand acts like a kind of like a mat, protecting the topsoil from compaction. So if the soil is susceptible to compaction, then we solve that. And the sand is better integrated into the in situ soil. This technique can also be very useful on sites where you're going to have difficulty working from the upslope area. Like if you absolutely must drive on the tested area or on the mound area, then you're having sand underneath it can protect it. It's also a very common technique, I don't know statewide, but at least in my area, for interpretive determination reports where we know the topsoil is susceptible to compaction and the subsoil is not very good. So this is something that's going to be on a lot of interpretive requirements. So that covers some things that can be done to prevent failure if the site was compacted prior to installation or to prevent compaction during installation. But what if the issue, if we look back to that failed mound, what if the issue was that the soils were smeared during construction? So here we see a picture of a mound area that was cleared and was being tested to see if it was plowable. If the soil is plastic enough that you can form a coil that's a 1/4 inch in diameter, it is too wet to plow. You just can't plow it. The result, if you do that, if you plow a mound area that is too wet, it isn't all that different in the end than a compacted site because the soil smears instead of breaking into nice little chunks of soil when it's plowed, and so the soil pores are closed off and the wastewater can't infiltrate. The difference is not that. And what is the solution to that? Well, you wait. You wait until it dries out. That's the only thing that can be done there. All right. So now let's say we really missed the mark, right? The soil was plowed, the mound was built, and what do we do? It's failing or it's leaking out the toe. Well, you could scrape it off, let it dry out, try again, discontinue the use of that mound, build a new mound, whatever, whatever, whatever. Or maybe there's something else that can be done. So maybe what we can do is extend the tested area, revise the plan, and extend the toe. So how much you'd have to do depends on the site, the soil conditions, and the severity of what's going on out there. So like any other time, the soil must be dry enough to plow. If you plow it and smear it again, it's not going to help out the situation here. So to do that, if the mound's already in use, you're going to have to use the tank as a temporary holding tank to allow that system area to dry out, because not only is it going to be precipitation, but also wastewater that's keeping that area wet. A toe extension can also be helpful if the compaction wasn't caught prior to installation, assuming, of course, and we're always assuming this in all scenarios, is that the soil is suitable for the component that's being placed on top. And when obviously I haven't been out to that site, that failed mound it's not in my work area, but something happened there and it's compacted. And how are we going to solve that? Probably there's going to be a downslope toe extension if, the soils are suitable, yada, 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 the whole thing. But I think that's probably how that will be fixed. We talk about mounds failing a lot because they're very visible, right? They're leaking out onto the land. But it's not just mounds that fail. We can also learn a thing or two from failed in-grounds as well. So here's a picture of a 5-year-old system that was sized for a 3-bedroom. In the house, there's 2 adults and 1 child, but the system is constantly ponded. The soil under the easy flow is glade. You can see it in that picture. Maybe this is not a soil color you see very often, but it's a glade soil, which is it really only forms in soils that are saturated for very, very long periods of time, so basically constantly. This system was sized using a 0.5 loading rate for fine sand. So where did things go wrong and what can we learn? So here's a photo of the natural soil. The slash in the pit wall that you see there is about where the system elevation is. At a 0.5 loading rate, the system needed 900 square feet of cell because it's a 3-bedroom system. But with the EISA credit that was used, I think, and don't hold me to this, but I think the design was 3 60-foot trenches or 540 square feet. In reality, when looking at this pit, the soil is probably a weak, fine, sandy loam. So that has a 0.2 loading rate, which would require 2,250 square feet of infiltrative surface, meaning that this system, as it was installed, is about a quarter of the size of the loading rate that the tables in 383 tell us should be. No wonder it's glayed and ponded, right? So what could have been done differently? Well, in all things, it comes back to describing the soils accurately. And maybe if you're not a soil tester, you get kind of tired of us talking about soils so much in POWTS chat. But really, really, really the basis of all systems and even holding tanks, because we're worried about, saturation and bury depth and things like that. It all comes down to the soil. So we're just going to be talking about it a lot. So there is possibility that on this site, obviously I wasn't out to it. They opened one pit. There's a possibility that there is variability in the soil, and we can even see that in the two pictures here. This one looks like it has a weak structure, and then if we go back, that doesn't look like it has structure to it. Granted, it's under a very, very wet system, but doesn't really look like it has much to it there. But if you're encountering variability, there needs to be enough pits to describe that variability, right? 3 is the minimum. Anything more is better. And that most restrictive soil that you see needs to be taken into consideration for the design. We're not designing for the best pit, we're designing for the worst. So what about going forward? How do we fix it, or what could have been done design-wise to avoid this? Well, maybe this site was better suited for a low mound, maybe. Or if an in-ground is absolutely necessary for some, I don't know, whatever reason it may be, absolutely necessary. Maybe it's mapped floodplain or something, but it's not actually going to flood. I don't know, whatever. But if it's got to be absolutely in-ground, maybe that restrictive horizon should be removed and replaced with sand to create a sand blanket. Would that solve this situation here? Probably not, because it doesn't look like it's just a restrictive horizon. It's a restrictive. There's restriction to pretty great depth there. But for other situations, maybe that would help. So here's my final failure of the day. Pictured here is a field for a 5-year-old dosed system that has been discharging out the vents, observation pipes. You can kind of see how it's bald around one of them and the cap is missing. But it's been discharging out of them basically since the day it was installed. Pump kicks on, wastewater comes out the pipes. Not great. So the system was designed for 3 bedrooms and 2 adults live in the home. Retired, work from home, they're home, but it's not a big family. And the soil test used the 2-foot rule, which, as a reminder, allows for a system to be installed in unsaturated coarse, loamy sand or coarser material, even though there is redox above it, as long as that redox is confined within a 2-foot or smaller horizon of tension saturated silt loam or finer material immediately overlying the coarse material. So that's a lot of modifiers. It's a lot of qualifiers to use that exemption. It has to meet all those things. Another interesting thing about this system design was the design also included an upslope interceptor drain, which is not a bad idea. But it is rather unusual. So there's probably something going on here that required that additional work as a part of the design. So what happened here? What could have been done differently? The same question that we ask for all systems that aren't functioning as they should be. Again, in this situation, it comes down again to accurately describing the soils. So while this site did have redox in the silt loam, it was more than 2 feet. So it doesn't meet that part of the exemption. And maybe that's variable across the site, but it was more than 2 feet. And the redox extended into the coarser underlying material, which additionally was not a coarse loamy sand. So you can see this picture here is of the coarse material. So when asked, about this, the soil tester recalled that the soil test was done on a very overcast and rainy day. than it was 5 years ago, or maybe 6 years ago when the soil test was done. So it must have been pretty miserable conditions if you're going to remember that. So just please take light conditions into consideration when soil testing, even in the middle of summer, if it's overcast, seeing redox in reddish soils and deep in a pit can be really, really difficult. And these days, the days are getting a lot shorter. So if you're thinking you're helping someone by getting out to do a soil test at 8 a.m. on an overcast day in October, November, December, the light conditions just aren't really, they just aren't good anymore. We want to be able to see the soil in its full form. And that's very difficult when the sun is low in the horizon. So additionally, the soil tester and, the plumber, it's not just the soil tester, everybody. Additionally, there could have been a better understanding of the site by having a more thorough conversation with the property owner. So when we were discussing about the site, the property owner let us know that the hill just upslope of the system, it seeps after large rain events and in the spring. So it's not like running springs, but it seeps. So that's a pretty good indication that this site might be wetter than the soils appear, if you think you're not seeing redox in them. Additionally, the system could have been installed in the full spirit of the plan. So like I said earlier, the plan called for an upslope interceptor drain, which just wasn't installed. Do I think that, installing that would have saved the system? To be honest, probably not. But maybe it could have helped in a less severe scenario, like if it actually met the 2-foot rule. Like if it was actually a legal system to install, if the soils were reported accurately, would it have helped? Probably. In this scenario, it didn't, and it wouldn't have, I don't think. So how do we fix it? How do we fix this specific scenario? So unfortunately for this house, the solution is a holding tank. Because every pit that was dug, and we dug a lot of pits out there, shovel pits, you start to go pockmark the land to see, had redox within 6 inches of the surface. Is just not a great site. So unfortunately, these folks went from having a system that never worked properly for 5 years, an in-ground system that never worked, to now having a holding tank. So not ideal at all, and something that we should strive to prevent. So that's all I'll say on the topic of, failed systems that we've seen this year and what we can learn from them. But if you just can't get enough of soils, and we're going to stop talking about soils here, but if you just can't get enough and you want to hear more, the SPS is hosting a soils pop-up next week, just south of La Crosse. So you can earn 2 continuing education hours for the CST credential, just the CST credential. It's not for plumbers. If you're a plumber, you're absolutely welcome to attend. Same with POWTS inspectors, yada, yada, but you won't get credit for those credentials. It's only for the CST credential for 2 hours for that. So the soils there are a little bit different than what you typically see, since it's the Mississippi River is right there. It should be pretty interesting, and the event is going to be Thursday the 23rd from 1 to 3 p.m. If you have any questions, please contact Jeff Brubaker. He's going to be the wastewater specialist that's there, and he's the one leading it. Should be a good time. All right. So the rest of my presentation covers tank sizing, which might seem really basic, but it's come up a lot this year. And so I thought even the beginning things need to be talked about. So we're going to go through septic, holding, and pump tank sizing through this presentation. So septic tank sizing is a function of the wastewater flow and the servicing frequency. So for all approval letters, and for most, 99.9, maybe that's an exaggeration, but a lot of system designs, we use a 36-inch servicing frequency. And the actual formula for septic tank sizing comes from the EPA from a long time ago, but basically, you take that whole formula and it boils down to 2.088 times the design wastewater flow. So for 1 bedroom, this is 314 gallons, 2 bedrooms, 627, 3 bedrooms, 940. These are the minimums. And 4 bedrooms, it's 1253 or 1200, which is interesting divergence. So out of all the possible tank sizing requirements, the minimums, the 4 bedroom is the only one that deviates from this formula. And for that, there's a 4% leeway that's allowed so that the tank can be 1,200 gallons, which is a very common tank size. It's been allowed since at least 2000. We haven't really seen issues with it. So for septic tanks, it's okay to use multiple tanks. But when you're calculating the total volume of the septic capacity, the pump tank volume is not included in that septic tank volume. So just as a reminder, it's come up as a question. Um, More tankage is fine, less is not. All right. So like I said, that 4% discretionary is allowed only for 4 bedrooms, and that's on the approval letters for the tanks. So holding tanks, how do we size holding tanks? Holding tanks require 5 times the estimated flow, not the design flow, the estimated flow, or a minimum of 2,000 gallons. So, and less may be possible with an ISD, which sometimes we see for, large commercial systems. Why are we putting 20,000 gallons of tankage out there? But anyway, for 1 to 4 bedrooms or up to 400 gallons per day commercial use, the minimum is 2,000 gallons. That's a component manual minimum. Yeah, and if you have multiple tanks, the alarm must be set to 90% of the total volume. So depending on how the tanks are connected and how many there are, the float, if you're using multiple tanks, might be positioned differently than it would normally be. People normally think you're 1 foot, but it might be very different if you're having many tanks in series. Holding tanks are pretty easy, but it bears to remind that it's the estimated flow, not the design. Pump tanks come in 2 flavors. So we have their simplex or the duplex style, which refers to the number of pumps in the tank, either 1 or 2. So for simplex pump tanks, the minimum volume is the estimated wastewater flow. So the number of bedrooms times 100 gallons plus 2 inches for the alarm. And then the volume of 1 dose and the drain back, if there is drain back, and the depth for the pump submergence and cover. The code required minimum for that, the dead space down at the bottom, is 4 inches. But really, that 4 inches is the absolute minimum to keep the pump, off the bottom of the tank and the impellers and stuff like that to keep it working. The component manual, however, has extra requirements saying that the pump manufacturer requirements shall be followed. And this may include the pump off switch being located high enough to allow for complete immersion of the pump in the tank. So realistically, full immersion for some of these pumps would be a lot, and the pump manufacturers don't usually require full, but 8 to 12 inches really is about the minimum that it should be for the block. It's including the block and the pump to have the pump cooled properly and operate properly. If you're using a larger block, that needs to be taken into consideration. We actually had a case come up this year where a system was just needing constant pump requirements, and come to find out the block is very tall, and the pump just wasn't operating really in the wastewater how it should be. So here is a typical, I say typical because it's pretty common, example of a dose tank set up in a 3-bedroom mound. So we need that 300 gallons of reserve, so 100 times the number of bedrooms. And then we divide that by the gallons per inch, which we find in the product approval, to get the A dimension in inches, because we need that so that we know that it fits within the liquid level of the tank. So I use 16.8 as that. Weezer Low Pro 1600 is a really common tank where, in my work region. And the GPI for it is 16.8. So when we do that, we get 18.21 inches. Great. Realistically, though, this number, that A dimension, is really just what's left over. So, and it has to hit the minimum, but it's what's left over. And we don't need to worry about easy to measure numbers here. If it's a weird number, that's okay. We're not setting a float to this number. Then we get our 2 inches for the alarm. 2 inches is the minimum. Some folks use 3. Great. Then there's the dose. And in this scenario, the dose is 67.53 gallons. Very precise based on the, lateral volumes. And the drain bag is 18.16 gallons. We divide that by the GPI and we get 4.51 or 4.5, close enough, gallons, which is a nice and easy tether length to set. That number can be variable, based upon the component manual that you're using. But it's nice to have a setting there that is achievable, because we want a system that can be installed per the plan. And then below that, in this example, we have 11 inches for the pump and block to live in. Would it be good to have more there? Yeah, yeah, probably. Why not? But the reserve basically is at its minimum. We see we only have 305 gallons there. So, and the dose is at its minimum. So that's as much as we can get in this specific tank, and that's okay. So moving on to duplex pumps, which is just a pump tank with two pumps, so that in the event that one dies, the other can continue dosing. Basically, it's the same, except the reserve capacity is no longer needed, as it is assumed that if the one pump will continue working as if the other one dies while it's being replaced and repaired. A 3-bedroom example, which I have here, is a very poor example of duplex pumps, because we don't use duplex pumps in 3-bedroom homes typically, but it's what I had. They're more commonly used in systems where the cost and hassle of installing two pumps is less than the cost, hassle, space constraint, or whatever it may be of the required reserve capacity. Duplex pumps are a lot more common in large commercial systems, or maybe even on cluster or multi-home systems, somewhere where we have a pretty high design flow. So now that we've had that refresher on sizing, I want to point your direction to the approval letters for the tanks. So there are two styles, basically, of approval letters for tanks. And as the renewals roll in, they're moving more towards the top format that we see on the screen, which packs a ton of information into that little table. So how do we read it? Well, we have here the model, which is self-explanatory. And then we have the liquid level, which is the depth in inches that there is in the tank at the outlet. Very useful for calculating all of your dimensions to make sure that the volumes that you set actually fit into your tank. And that, it tells you how many inches you have to divvy up for your pump tank dimensions. Next to that, we see our gallons per inch in each compartment. This one here, compartment 1, is typically the septic tank. It's the first compartment. Compartment 2 is the one that would typically be used for the pump tank, and that tells us our gallons per inch for calculating that. So here we have the Weiser Low Pro 1600 MR, 16.8 gallons per inch. It's actually 16.76. Either is fine. We just want it installed right. So the next two columns then is what confuses people sometimes. So we have our gallons per day, and this is the amount that is approved for these. So if this tank is being used just for a septic tank, so both compartments are septic, then it is approved for 772 gallons per day. Now, if the first compartment is the septic and the second compartment is the pump, then that capacity of the pump tank, like I said before, is not included in the septic tank capacity, so our allowable gallons per day is reduced. So it's 482 gallons per day. That's just basically the septic tank sizing for the first compartment. So next column is the holding tank capacity. So if the tank is approved for use as a holding tank, it'll have that. Next is the max depth of bury. 96 is about what it is normally. If it's a stronger tank, maybe it'd be 144 inches. It depends. But that's something you need to keep in mind when you're planning how deep to bury these tanks. And then the next and last column is the manufacturer specified uses, which tells you what it's allowed to be used for. So H for holding, P for pump, septic, SPT, and siphon, SPH. So that's all that I have. I hope you all have a wonderful fall, and I hope to see you in November, or I hope to see you. I won't be there, but we hope to see you at the soils training if you can make it.